Funding for Idaho Reports is provided by the Friends of 4, 10, and 12, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by a grant from the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation.
There will be no Idaho Wilderness Bill in this session of the Congress.
Yesterday, Senator James McClure announced the end of the battle over an Idaho Wilderness Bill. Tonight, we look at why a wilderness compromise was impossible and what it means for the future of national forest roadless areas in Idaho. Good evening. Various attempts to fix blame and assess responsibility for the failure of an Idaho wilderness bill continued today amid new speculation about how the wilderness issue in Idaho will be handled in the future. The state's all-Republican congressional delegation is saying that the blame for the just adjourned Congress not passing a bill should fall squarely into the lap of environmentalists, who have contended for months that the delegation's proposal contains not nearly enough wilderness acreage in Idaho. Meanwhile, as United Press International put it in one of their stories today, quote, environmental leaders in Idaho are breathing fire back at the delegation. Environmentalists saying the delegation, led by Senator James McClure and Representative Larry Craig, have displayed poor leadership on the wilderness issue. We'll be hearing from an environmentalist on that subject in just a moment, but first we'll hear what three members of the congressional delegation were saying about all of this yesterday.
We started out with a bill of 526,000 acre addition to the nearly 4 million acres that already exist in wilderness in Idaho. And many people called upon us to compromise with the people who contended for more. We offered a series of compromises, increasing the acreage that would be put into wilderness. As it turned out, they wanted all or nothing, and they've ended up with nothing. I am sorry that we have not been able to produce that bill. I think it's not a doomsday prediction for people of Idaho, but certainly the people of Idaho who are most involved in this could have been served better had we been able to produce a bill.
Without actually naming him, Republican Congressman Larry Craig seemed to blame Democratic Governor John Evans for the failure to reach a wilderness compromise.
If we had had the kind of leadership from the state of Idaho in the early days that we believed we were going to get, I believe, and I believe also that the senator thinks, we could have had a bill this session.
Republican Senator Steve Sims was even more pointed, blaming the lack of a compromise on environmental extremists.
It really is a good lesson, I think, for everyone to see how greedy and selfish the extreme environmentalist position is. That they really didn't want anything, because the way it is now, they have de facto wilderness on the 9 million acres in question. And it's unfortunate we didn't get a bill settled for the working men and women in Idaho and resolve it, but there just was no compromise on the side of the environmental extremists. So I think what we should do next year is just have a bill just to release lands to multiple use and not talk about any more wilderness, and we'll start from that point.
The delegation's final Idaho wilderness proposal, rejected just night before last, was 670,000 acres. As this process has developed over the last year, there have been a lot of figures. Here are some of them, ranging from a proposal offered by mining, livestock, and motorized recreational interests that no existing roadless lands be designated wilderness, to a suggestion from the environmental group Earth First that all of the existing roadless land in the state be classified as wilderness. Most of the state's environmental groups came down in favor of a 3.4 million acre recommendation, which eventually gained support in the U.S. House by several Democratic congressmen from the eastern part of the United States. Ron Mitchell lobbied hard for that proposal as a member of the Idaho Sportsmen's Coalition. Mr. Mitchell is an Idaho outdoor writer. Senator Sims says it was environmental extremists, presumably people like you, Mr. Mitchell, who killed this bill. Is he right?
Well, he's right that extremists killed the bill, but it certainly wasn't the environmental community. There's 9.2 million acres out there, as Steve acknowledged, and we propose that 2/3 of that be opened up for development. but that approximately 1/3 of that be protected. And other groups, as you say, wanted all the way from 8 million acres to 5 million acres. So we had compromised significantly, and we felt that since these were critical wildlife lands, that they deserved to be protected, and that protecting 1/3 of those lands was a reasonable position.
What about Senator McClure's comment there on the videotape about what he saw, at least, as an all-or-nothing position on your part, that you offered your proposal and apparently, in his mind, weren't willing to come down very much from that proposal?
Yeah, that isn't true. I spent an entire month in Washington working on this. We were willing to come even below our 3.4 figure, and in negotiations we did. But the delegation did almost nothing all through July, and they waited until the last 2 weeks of the session before they attempted to reach a compromise. And in those negotiations, they still stuck pretty closely to their original proposal. They didn't go any place near 1 million acres of wilderness. And their proposal of 526,000 acres is 1/18 of those ROTUS lands, and that is not a reasonable proposal, and they simply wouldn't give on that.
So it was the McClures and the Sims and the Craigs who weren't giving much, in your view?
I think so, yeah. No doubt about that.
Just quickly, give me a couple of the areas that really hung this up. Obviously, there were specific negotiations about specific acreages and areas. Where were the real hang-up points, just quickly?
Right. The negotiations broke down over the South Fork of the Salmon and over Mallard Larkins. Mallard Larkins is the last roadless elk hunting area in North Idaho. It has over 1,100 elk. It's got 150 mountain goats, 35 mountain lakes, and it's a prime area for the north part of the state. The South Fork of the Salmon, of course, used to produce 55% of the summer Chinook salmon in the Columbia River drainage. The river is beginning to heal itself, and the potential is there for that to again become the stellar salmon stream of the Columbia River drainage.
And those were places where you weren't willing to compromise, and neither was the delegation. You had it in your proposal and they didn't, and you couldn't get together on those areas.
That's right.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but fundamentally, the folks who look at this the same way you do aren't really heartbroken about not having a bill, are you?
No, it's if we had gotten a bill, it would have meant that these other lands could be released for development, and it looked like there was no way that we could get a good bill this year, that the only kind of bill we could get would be a bad one. So now we can come back with our proposal again next year, and in the meantime garner more public support. Evidently we have 47% of the people in the state right now who want more wilderness, and when we begin to talk about the areas on an area-specific basis and show the outdoorsmen of this state what kinds of values are being threatened, then we're going to have that public support, and I think we'll probably succeed next year, and if not then, in '86.
Well, thank you. We'll come back. Governor John Evans was today expressing disappointment at the failure of a wilderness compromise. Evans saying he did everything possible to bring the differing interests together on the issue. Yet the governor, as you've already heard, has been roundly criticized by some for his role in the wilderness process. Pat Costello is counsel for the governor and has worked extensively on the wilderness issue. Representative Craig's criticism, Mr. Costello, of the governor, fair?
Well, as you mentioned, he didn't name the governor. He referred to the lack of leadership in Idaho, and I include the congressional delegation in the state's leadership.
Well, you don't think Representative Craig was criticizing himself, though, do you?
Well, I don't know. I'm trying to put the best light on it, I guess. That's the way I would look at it. I don't think that the governor could have done any more than he did. He got personally involved in the negotiations. He went back to Washington during the critical week of the negotiation process because he was concerned that very little movement appeared to be taking place. He served as a catalyst for some discussions that otherwise would never have taken place back there between the various interest groups and the House and Senate members. I think the reason, as I've gone back and talked to some of the people who were involved in the negotiations, I think the real reason they didn't result in a bill this year, whereas other states got their wilderness bill, is largely a function of the fact that so much more was at stake here. Idaho already has a fairly large wilderness system, larger than any of the other 48 states outside of Alaska. There were 8 million acres, roadless area acres involved here. And because there was so much at stake, the interest groups on both sides were very, devoted a lot of attention to this issue. They also, I believe, started too late to bring the parties together.
Who started too late?
Well, they didn't get a bill out of the Senate early enough to get the process rolling in the House so that they could get a bill in the House and then go to conference committee and get it resolved.
So it seems almost as though you're saying that there's enough blame for everybody to take a little slice of the action.
Well, I don't think it does much good at this stage to point fingers. The governor still remains optimistic that we can get right back to work on this in January, and he's not going to try to polarize the issue by trying to lay blame on other people.
Well, let me ask you finally, the governor said today in a news release that as this process developed, it became clear to him that the forest industry, the timber concerns that were supporting the delegation's bill in essence, became less and less interested themselves in getting a bill. Why would that be?
The forest products industry representatives that met with the governor told him as much, that they had about concluded that the only way to get a bill was to give up more acreage to wilderness than they felt they could justify, and that they would be better off going through the forest planning process in order to open up additional acres. It was a very dramatic shift in the mood of the negotiations when the forest products industry did back off from what had earlier been a fairly strong support for getting a bill this year. And it was right after they announced that they had shifted away from pushing for a bill this year that the governor felt it was necessary for him to go back there and try to get negotiations back on track.
We'll come back, thanks. Another view of this now from Mary Lou Franzese. She's a resource planner with Potlatch Corporation, a major timber and wood products company with operations in northern Idaho. Ms. Franzese joins us tonight from Moscow. From where you look at this, why did this whole process fall apart and a bill not result?
Well, first of all, I'd like to also mention that my part in participating in this process has really been as a representative for Idaho Women in Timber, which is an organization of women with a few male members, of people whose livelihoods and lifestyle depend on the Idaho forest. Just to clear that up.
Okay.
I think it's difficult to pinpoint or specifically apply the blame to an individual or a few individuals about why a bill didn't go this year. In my exposure and going back to represent Idaho Women in Timber, I don't believe there was a lack of energy or effort on the part of the delegation. They've really worked very hard towards achieving a bill this year, and I could say from observing industry representatives that I think that's also the case for that group, as well as environmentalists. From my point of view, I think the governor could have played a much stronger role in this effort. I believe he came into the negotiation game a little bit too late and without really specifying area by area what his position would be, which could have acted as a rallying point and a leadership person for the other groups negotiating. I also think there's sort of a broader issue here, and that is the issue of trust of the Forest Service from the position of Idaho Women in Timber and maybe in terms of the industry. We have a little more trust in the Forest Service in managing roadless lands. After all, the wilderness, no wilderness decision is really just at the top of a hierarchy and deciding the big question about how you manage Forest Service land.
I don't want to interrupt you, but let me come back to that point if you'll allow me to a little bit later.
Sure.
Let me ask you specifically about Mr. Costello's comments here about the governor's perception that the timber industry had become reluctant about a bill as well, simply because they might have had, the timber industry might have had to go to an acreage figure that they would have found unacceptable.
Well, I think that's true to a certain extent. There was a lot of effort to look at just how high we could go, and there were major areas of controversy where both of the sides were not willing to give a whole lot. And I think that's probably to be expected. There were also quite a few areas of agreement, and I think maybe the industry just got to a point as we got closer and closer to various proposals that the delegation introduced of seeing that the environmentalists would not go beyond a certain point, and there were areas that we simply could not agree on.
Right. Well, we'll come back. Thank you very much. Finally now, the view of another timber and wood products company, Truss Joist, located in Boise. Walter Minnick is the president of that company. He lobbied the Congress for a wilderness bill to contain more acreage than the Idaho delegation had proposed. Mr. Minnick, you worked in Washington, D.C. back during the Nixon administration. You know how that city works. What happened here? Was it a lack of political leadership on someone's part?
I don't think the failure is a lack of leadership really on anybody's part. It's a function of the fact that our delegation ideologically is at a polar extreme on the wilderness issue. 3 of our 4 senators and representatives are ideologically in favor of no wilderness at all. The 4th, Senator McClure, is basically taking the position as little as possible. And I think that was reflected in the delegation's initial proposal. Only about 6% of the land under question was in the bill, and they were willing to go all the way to 9%. That wasn't much movement compared to the 100% at issue, and I think it does reflect the ideological complexion of the delegation more than anything else, and the strength of their feeling that wilderness is basically not in the public interest here in Idaho.
Well, let me read to you something out of Senator McClure's press release on this subject today. He said that the inability to reach an agreement essentially came down to this is quoting him, a difference of opinion between Idahoans and a small national constituency that's in support of large additions to wilderness. You don't agree with that, I take it?
I think the senator may be overstating the unanimity of Idahoans on the issue. You can get about any answer from a poll you want, depending on how you ask the question. The polls that I've seen that ask questions neutrally suggest that somewhere between 40 and 50% of Idahoans would like to see additions to the wilderness system. Something maybe slightly greater than that either don't know or opposed to it. So I think the state is split, as is the nation, on the issue. But our delegation is all in one camp.
Didn't the delegation, though, come quite a way in their final compromise figure of 670,000? And there's all kinds of ways you can interpret what that figure means, but didn't they make quite a bit of movement ultimately toward some compromise?
I wasn't a party to those negotiations, so I'm probably not the best person to ask that, Mark.
Well, they went from 526,000 to 670,000 acres, and they took out 140,000 acres in the White Clouds area. That was one of the compromises they made. They offered to set aside a substantial amount of acreage to take another look at, essentially. Wasn't that some good effort of good faith on the part of Senator McClure and others?
It was an effort to compromise around the edges, and I think they wanted a bill and were willing to go a ways, but it was only a very small ways toward the position of the people on the other side of the issue. Most of the compromising was done on the other side. The problem was they ran out of time and just couldn't get close enough, and I think that's unfortunate.
Well, on that point, let me open it up and go back to Moscow. Do you agree with that, that most of the compromising was made on the environmental side?
No, I don't. I think we need to look at the other figures that came out of that, what I believe was the last proposal on the part of the delegation. There wasn't only 670,000 acres proposed for wilderness designation, but another 225,000 acres proposed for a mandated wilderness study, and add on another 700,000 acres that would be specifically mandated to remain roadless during the first 10-year planning cycle, the Forest Service planning, and then another 1,000,000 acres that would be in some sort of status quo category, which would mean the wilderness, no wilderness decision would take place in the planning process. And then finally, the other lands would be released. And release is not the same as we wrote it all and everything's timber management. And I think that's part of the trust issue. Maybe we'll get more into that later.
We will in just 1 second. Let me ask Mr. Mitchell about that. Since Senator McClure's not here to defend himself, let me try to make the argument that he might make, considering Mr. Minnick's point that ideologically these folks that represent this state don't think that we need much more wilderness, if any at all, that they really believe that they were representing their constituents in advancing the proposal they did, and that they did make quite a step in the direction that you would like to have seen them make.
They didn't make much of a compromise in terms of coming up to 600,000 acres because and taking out the Boulder White Clouds, because Senator McClure had already stated earlier last year that the Boulder White Clouds ought not to be a part of the proposal. And then to pad his 500,000 acres, he went ahead and put the Boulder White Clouds back in. So it wasn't compromising when he took those out. That was just a ploy. So what you essentially had is an offer of 670,000 acres of wilderness. You had 200,000 acres of wilderness study, 700,000 acres protected for the first planting cycle. The 1,000,000 acres or so that was proposed really was not any kind of compromise. That was simply, those lands are simply going to be surrendered to the Forest Service planting cycle, which usually means that they get logged and developed.
Well, as a practical matter, though, I think as Ms. Franzese is suggesting, that's exactly what's happened to all of the 8 million acres now, or almost 9 million acres, right? It's all back into the planting cycle.
Right.
So what happens, let me ask all of you, or any of you, what happens now?
Now, as I said before, we will have time to become better organized, and we will be working to further educate the public on the values in each one of these areas, and we will build constituency support for them. We haven't had time. You know, we were caught in April by surprise, and we will also be working hand in hand with the Fish and Game Department to get constituency support for the 2 million acres of those 8 million acres, which is critical wildlife habitat, as identified not by wild-eyed environmentalists or tree huggers, but by hard-nosed biologists, scientists in the department.
Okay. Mr. Minnick, how about what happens now?
I think that you're getting closer to the real issue, because even if a wilderness bill had passed, the vast majority of the land is going to be subject to the normal Forest Service planning process. And it's the way the Forest Service conducts that management that I think is the real issue here in Idaho, not how many acres are in wilderness. And I think the reason why many people on the environmental side want a large wilderness addition is that they think the Forest Service does a pretty poor job of managing areas that are currently roadless.
You just happen to bring along a visual aid that you think illustrates that.
Yes, I
think we
did.
can show it now. Go ahead and describe, we can have it put up on the monitor down here so you can see it. Go ahead and describe your map.
That is a map of something called the Jersey Jack area. It's 70,000 to 80,000 acres north of the Salmon River.
That's the gold area.
That's correct. That was part of the old Idaho primitive area. It was left out of wilderness as a result of decisions by the congressional delegation the last time wilderness was debated. It's currently roadless except for those dark lines. Those are the existing road network.
Okay, now there's that's an overlay that underneath shows what?
That's the Forest Service management plan for that area. That's some of the best elk habitat in Idaho. It's also right on the border of the Salmon River, some of the most erodible terrain in Idaho.
And that's what the Forest Service is planning. Those are the roads that the Forest Service is planning to build into that area.
That mess of spaghetti is the road network, the permanent road network that the Forest Service is planning to add in that area. The dark green line is the Jersey Jack Road. That road is all-weather, paved. It's going to cost $1.5 million of the taxpayers' dollars to build. The rest of those red roads are going to cost another $8 million to build, and it's going to cost the taxpayer about another $500,000 to maintain those roads during the 20 years it will take to harvest the timber in that area.
So the point being, it's not cost effective, and this, in your view, is the kind of management that the Forest Service can't be trusted to do.
In addition to those costs, it's going to cost about $1.5 million to take the timber off and reforest the land. That's a total of about $11.5 million that's going to come out of the taxpayer's pocket to harvest the timber there. Under the most generous of assumptions, there is somewhere between $6 and $7 million worth of timber in the area, and that's assuming that it's valued at 1978 stumpage prices, which are far in excess of current prices. So it's going to cost the taxpayer to harvest that timber $2 or $3 in out-of-pocket costs for every dollar of timber receipts they're going to get. And that seems to me to be extremely poor public policy, particularly when it's some of the finest wildlife habitat in Idaho, and that will also be sacrificed. And that's illustrative of the way the Forest Service is planning to manage really the majority of the area that's currently roadless.
Well, Ms. Franzese, that Mr. Minnick obviously doesn't share your trust in the Forest Service's ability to manage these areas.
Well, off the top, I don't believe we can really say that automatically, because it's not wilderness, and that means it's going to be all roaded, and I think that's totally inappropriate. My most contact is with the Clearwater National Forest, and in their preferred alternative for the planning process, they're planning on sticking, assuming there'd be 185,000 acres in a wilderness or permanent roadless category, plus another 270 in roadless status, plus the 260,000 are already in wilderness, adds up to about 700,000 acres, or a third of the forest that would remain in roadless status for that plan. And after that, you have a remaining area that then becomes available for producing other kinds of benefits, and that doesn't mean it's necessarily going to be timber. It may be a management prescription that precludes timber management.
Well, let me ask you this. As a practical matter, as this planning process continues now, won't we see many of these areas hassled out in court?
I think that's will be very much the case. A lot of people may not understand the Forest Service planning process. It was mandated by the National Forest Management Act, and it's also guided by the National Environmental Policy Act, and a long list of other laws, Endangered Species Act, policies, so forth.
So there's lots of places for people to sue.
Yeah, there's lots of areas of vulnerability.
Yeah. True, Mr. Minnick? Want to see a lot of this stuff in court?
We may see some of it, but I think to say the Forest Service doesn't plan to road most of it is not accurate. The Forest Service plans to spend $1 billion, not $1 million or $100 million, but $1 billion putting in roads over the next 14 years into areas that are currently roadless. They have employment of about 350 people, devoted engineers and people devoted to planning that road network. And Senator Sims told me back at the hearing that his management plan is to road it all so that we can manage it like an orchard.
Well, his isn't the Forest Service's necessarily. And I think you also have to remember that the decision on these lands have been delayed for a long period of time. This isn't the first year we've looked at.
I'm terribly sorry. I'm going to have to interrupt you. We're out of time. We'll have to come back to this with all of you, I hope, sometime. Ms. Franzese in Moscow, thank you for joining us. We appreciate it. Mr. Minnick, Mr. Costello, and Mr. Mitchell, thank you, gentlemen. That's our time for tonight. I'm Mark Johnson. We'll be back on Monday. Good night.
Funding for Idaho Reports is provided by the Friends of 4, 10, and 12, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by a grant from the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation.